The Mafia boss gave her abusive ex exactly 3 seconds to let go or lose both hands. Olivia's wrist was turning purple as Tyler dragged her through a crowded Italian restaurant, while every wealthy customer pretended not to see. Then Dominic Lombardi rose from the darkest table in the room. He was the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago, a man whose whisper could terrify an entire city. Tyler laughed at him until Dominic began counting, but after the abuser ran away, Dominic placed a black card in Olivia's trembling hand and made one chilling promise. Paper cannot stop monsters, but I can. The glass shattered against the polished hardwood floor. The smooth jazz music, playing through the hidden speakers of Vincenzo S., seemed to stop dead. Everyone turned to look. I could feel their wealthy, indifferent eyes burning right into my skin. I could not breathe. My wrist was caught in a grip so tight. My fingers were instantly turning white. Tyler's face was inches from mine. His eyes were wide. They were wild. They were dark and frantic, and full of that familiar, suffocating poison he always called love. You are going to throw away 2 years of our lives for this garbage waitressing job, he hissed. His breath smelled like stale coffee, expensive mints, and pure desperation. You are coming with me right now. We are going to talk about this like adults. I tried to pull back, I really did. But my shoes slipped on the spilled ice water. The entire restaurant was watching us. Rich men in tailored suits paused with their forks in the air. Women in silk dresses pulled their designer bags closer. They all looked away the second my eyes met theirs. Nobody wants to step into a domestic mess. Nobody wants to be the hero on a random Tuesday night. I felt the familiar panic rising in my throat. It was the exact same panic that had choked me for 2 long years. It happened so slowly, you know. The abuse. That is what people do not understand. It does not start with a grabbed wrist or a screaming match in public. It starts with a bouquet of roses delivered to your work. It starts with a simple question. Who are you texting so late? Then it becomes a gentle suggestion. I do not think your friends are good for you. They do not understand our connection. Before you know it, you are entirely cut off from the world. You are trapped in a room with a man who tells you the sky is green, and you are so emotionally exhausted. You just nod and agree. I had finally found the courage to leave him 3 months ago. 3 months of supposed freedom. But it was not really freedom. It was just a different, wider kind of prison. He called 47 times last week. 47. I counted every single one. I changed my number. He found my email. I moved to a cheaper apartment. He somehow found my new route to work. He was a shadow that absolutely refused to fade. And now he was here. He was physically dragging me toward the exit of my workplace. You are embarrassing yourself. Liv, he growled. He dug his fingers even deeper into my skin, right over the delicate bone. Stop making a scene. That was his favorite trick. Making his violence my fault. Making me feel crazy for reacting to his pain. I opened my mouth to scream. I wanted to yell for the manager, but the sound died in my dry throat. I felt paralyzed. Then it happened. A voice cut through the heavy, suffocated silence of the dining room. It was not loud. It did not need to be loud. It carried a quiet, lethal authority that instantly made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She told you to stop. The words were smooth, cold, and wrapped in a faint accent. Tyler froze. I stopped breathing. From the darkest, most secluded corner of the mahogany bar, a man stood up, Dominic Lombardi. He sat at table 12 every single night. I had poured his water 100 times. I had cleared his empty plates. He never stared at me like the other men did. He never made cheap small talk. He just watched the room with eyes like black ice. I knew exactly what he was. Everyone in the south side of Chicago knew what he was. You do not wear a charcoal suit that expensive, and you do not have massive men standing silently by the exits, unless you own the shadows of the city. Tyler puffed up his chest. He let go of my wrist, just enough to turn around and face the interruption. This is none of your business, buddy. This is a private conversation between me and my girlfriend. Ex-girlfriend, my voice cracked. I forced the words out anyway. My throat burned. Dominic did not rush. He walked across the dining room with slow, deliberate grace. He moved like a predator that already knows all the exits are blocked. He stopped exactly 3 feet from Tyler. He looked down at Tyler's hand, still gripping my arm. Then he slowly looked up at Tyler's face. Take your hand off her, Dominic said. His voice was almost a whisper. It was terrifyingly calm. Before you lose the privilege of having hands at all. Tyler laughed. It was a thin, nervous, breathy sound. Are you threatening me? I am stating a fact, Dominic replied smoothly. He did not blink. You have exactly 3 seconds to walk out that door. Tyler's arrogant mask shattered. He dropped my arm like it was on fire. He backed away. He tried to sneer. He tried to look like a tough corporate guy, but his hands were visibly shaking. This is not over, Liv, Tyler spat at me. He pointed a trembling finger in my direction. We are not done talking, yes. She is, Dominic said. He did not even look at Tyler. He just dismissed him entirely. Tyler scrambled out the front glass doors and disappeared into the freezing Chicago rain. The restaurant exhaled a collective breath. The jazz music nervously started up again. Waiters began clearing plates. I leaned heavily against a chair. My legs felt like water. I looked down at my arm. The angry red marks in the shape of Tyler S. fingers were already turning purple. Dominic stood there in his immaculate suit. He looked at the bruises. A muscle feathered tightly in his jaw. "You need a restraining order," he said gently. It was the softest I had ever heard him speak. I shook my head. I fought back hot. Humiliating tears, they do not work. I have tried to tell the police. It is just a piece of paper. He does not care about rules. He knows the law cannot stop him until he actually hits me. Dominic looked at me for a long, heavy moment. His dark eyes seemed to strip away all my walls, all my defenses. He reached into his inside pocket. He pulled out a thick, matte, black business card. There was only a phone number embossed on it in silver. No name, no company logo. "Then you keep this," he said. He pressed the thick card into my trembling palm. His fingers were warm, but they did not linger. He did not try to hold my hand or comfort me. Paper does not stop monsters, Olivia, but I do. I went to the cold, sprawling courthouse the very next morning. The air inside smelled like cheap floor bleach and stale coffee. The judge looked exhausted, flipping through endless files. He barely looked at my bruised wrist. He stamped the paper. Granted. Tyler Morrison was now legally required to stay 100 yards away from me at all times. I held the official document in my hands. It felt lighter than air. It felt utterly useless, and I was absolutely right. Abusers do not respect legal boundaries. They view the word no as a challenge to their authority. It is all a sick game of power to them. If they cannot control you with fake love, they will control you with raw fear. Just 3 days later, the system failed me. I was walking home from a late, exhausting shift at Vincenzo's. The Chicago wind was biting. It cut right through my thin winter coat. The streetlights flickered overhead. I turned the corner onto my quiet street. My heart stopped dead in my chest. He was there. Tyler. He was leaning casually against the brick wall, right next to the front door of my apartment building. He was smoking a cigarette. He was smiling. It was that terrible, patient, knowing smile. "You cannot hide from me behind a piece of paper. Live," he called out. His voice echoed loudly in the empty, dark street. I read the order. 100 yards. I think I am at exactly 101. We belong together. You just need to stop fighting it and realize it. Panic spiked through my veins. It was cold and sharp and paralyzing. I backed away slowly. My hand fumbled blindly in my coat pocket. My cold fingers brushed against the thick matte paper of the card Dominic had given me. I pulled out my phone. I dialed the number. My hands were shaking so violently, I almost dropped the phone onto the icy pavement. It rang exactly once, yes. Dominic's voice was instantly alert. "Wide awake, he is here," I gasped. The words tumbled out of my mouth in a rushed sob. "He is outside my building. I cannot go inside, I am trapped." Dominic's voice dropped an octave. It instantly became a military command. "Where are you right now?" "Tell me the exact cross street," I told him. "Go into the brightly lit convenience store on the corner," he ordered. "Stand right by the cashier. Do not look at him. Do not talk to him. I am sending someone right now. Give me 10 minutes." I ran. I ran so fast my lungs burned with the freezing air. I burst through the glass doors of the brightly lit store. The bell chimed loudly. The cashier jumped behind the counter. I hid behind a tall display of chips. I watched the dark street through the dirty glass window. Tyler was walking slowly toward the store. He was taking his time. He was enjoying this. He knew I was trapped like a mouse. He stood outside the glass. He tapped a coin on the window. Tick, tick, tick. It was pure psychological torture. He was showing me that he owned my fear. 11 minutes passed. Then tires screeched so loud it sounded like a crash. A massive, tinted black SUV jumped the curb. It parked at a severe angle. It blocked the sidewalk entirely, trapping Tyler against the brick wall. 2 huge men stepped out. I instantly recognized one of them. Anthony Greco, Dominic's right-hand man. He had silver hair and moved like a ghost. He did not draw a weapon. He did not yell. He did not make a scene. He just walked right up to Tyler. Tyler puffed his chest out again, trying to look brave. But Anthony just reached into his suit jacket and held up a cell phone. I could not hear the conversation through the thick glass, but I watched Tyler's face closely. I watched the blood completely drain out of his cheeks. I watched his arrogant, controlling mask crumble into absolute, primitive terror. Anthony put the phone away. He pointed a single finger down the street. Tyler turned and ran. He literally ran into the dark, slipping on the ice. Anthony looked through the store window at me. He gave a single, highly respectful nod. Then he got back in the SUV and drove away into the night. My phone buzzed in my hand. A text from an unknown number flashed on the screen. "You are safe, go home, he will not return." I stood there, I clutched my chest, taking my first real breath in 2 years. That was the exact night everything shifted in my mind. I finally realized the profound difference between toxic control and genuine protection. Tyler wanted to control my every move. He wanted to know my passwords, my friends, my deepest thoughts. He wanted to lock me in a tiny box. Dominic stepped in from the shadows. He saved my life, and he did not even ask to come upstairs. Over the next few weeks, Dominic and I actually started talking. Really talking. He would sit at table 12. I would bring his black coffee. We talked about my life, my dreams. I told him I wanted to be a freelance graphic designer. I told him Tyler used to secretly delete my design software. Tyler told me it took my attention away from our relationship. 2 days after that conversation, a heavy package was delivered to the restaurant. A brand new, top-of-the-line design laptop. There was no creepy note, just my name printed on the box. I tried to give it back to him that night. I told him I did not want to be bought. I told him I could not owe a man like him. He looked at me with those intense, dark eyes. "It is not a leash. Olivia, it is a tool. I do not want your passwords. I do not want to see your screen. I want you to build your own life. Show them what you can do. That is what healthy love looks like. That is the greatest humanistic lesson I ever learned. Love does not shrink you to fit into a tiny, manageable box. It gives you the heavy tools to build a much bigger room." He was a highly dangerous man, but he was the safest place I had ever known in my entire life. But safety is a fragile illusion. When you are standing next to a man who basically owns the underworld. The shift in our reality happened very subtly at first. I started noticing more men in dark, tailored suits. They were always drinking coffee across the street from my apartment. Anthony started showing up at the Italian restaurant an hour before my shift ended. He just stood silently near the exit, watching the door. The air around Dominic grew thick with a dark tension I could not name. We were having dinner one night, a very quiet upscale Italian place. He had rented the restaurant out entirely, just for the two of us. He was tracing the rim of his crystal wine glass. His jaw was set tight. "There is a developing situation," he said quietly, not looking at me. "A rival group, the Cartel Dello. They are testing my borders. They are looking for leverage. They know I have a weakness now." He finally looked up, his dark eyes met mine, filled with a terrifying sincerity. "They know about you." A freezing chill ran straight down my spine. The ghost of Tyler's pathetic emotional abuse was absolutely nothing compared to the violent reality of organized crime. "I am significantly increasing your security detail," he continued. "You will not walk alone. You will not take the subway. You will ride in my cars." I nodded slowly. I trusted him completely. But I did not understand how incredibly fast violence could move. It happened on a cold Thursday evening. I was taking out the heavy trash bags at the back of the restaurant. It was a mundane chore I always did. The back alley was pitch black. It smelled strongly of damp cardboard and old garlic. I threw the heavy bags into the metal dumpster. I turned around to walk back inside. There was no sound, no warning, just a sudden, violent displacement of the freezing air. A heavy hand clamped brutally over my mouth. The thick glove tasted like dirty leather and gun grease. A massive, muscular arm wrapped tight around my waist. It lifted my feet completely off the ground. I kicked wildly, I thrashed. I remembered Tyler. I remembered the suffocating feeling of being trapped. But this was vastly different. This was cold and professional. They spoke in rapid, hushed Spanish. They were dragging me aggressively toward a rusted, unmarked van idling at the dark end of the alley. I screamed with everything I had, but the sound was entirely swallowed by the heavy leather glove. I thought I was going to disappear forever. Then the night absolutely exploded. It was a deafening, echoing crack. The man holding me jerked violently forward. Hot, wet blood splattered across my pale cheek. His iron grip vanished instantly. I hit the wet, freezing pavement hard, scraping my knees raw. My ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine. The dark alley lit up brightly with rapid muzzle flashes. It was chaos, absolute terrifying. Sensory chaos. Men were shouting orders. Bullets were tearing chunks out of the brick walls. Red brick dust filled the air, choking me. I scrambled desperately under the metal dumpster. I curled into a tiny trembling ball. I pressed my hands hard over my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut. I thought I was going to die right there in the dirt. I thought this was the ultimate price of loving a man who lived and breathed in the dark. The deafening gunfire stopped almost as quickly as it had started. There was loud shouting, deep groans of pain. Then, heavy footsteps running directly toward me. Fast, desperate Olivia. The voice was raw. It was torn to absolute shreds. I opened my eyes. Dominic dropped heavily to his knees right in the filthy slush of the alleyway. His expensive custom suit was ruined. His chest was heaving uncontrollably. He did not look like the calm, collected, untouchable boss anymore. He looked like a man who had just personally witnessed the end of the world. He reached under the dirty dumpster. He pulled me out roughly. He dragged me fiercely into his chest. He wrapped his strong arms around me so tightly, I could barely breathe. I could hear his heart hammering wildly against his ribs. It was beating out of control. "I am here," I whispered. My voice was shaking uncontrollably. "I am okay." He buried his face deep in my neck. His large hands were trembling. The powerful man who ordered armies. The man who never ever flinched. He was shaking like a fragile leaf in the wind. "I got you," he choked out, his voice cracking. "I got you." I looked slowly over his shoulder. The alley was a literal war zone. There were bodies on the ground. The brutal reality of his hidden world hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. This was not a movie scene. This was real blood pooling on the cold concrete. This was the horrific cost of his protection. But as I clung desperately to his ruined jacket, smelling the sharp tang of gunpowder and his expensive cologne, I realized something deeply terrifying about myself. I was not running away from him. I was holding on even tighter. We fought that night. It was a violent, screaming, emotional argument, right in the very center of his massive, glass-walled penthouse. The adrenaline from the alley shootout was still pumping furiously through our veins. "You are moving in here tonight," Dominic roared. He was pacing the hardwood floor like a caged, furious panther. "You are never going back to that apartment. You are not working at that restaurant ever again. You will stay here. I will put a massive wall of guns and men between you and the rest of the city." I stood my ground. My hands were still shaking from the attack, but my voice was surprisingly steady. "No," I yelled back at him. "I will not do it. I will not trade one cage for another." Tyler looked at me away, because he said the outside world was too dangerous. "You are trying to do the exact same thing to me." Dominic stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at me. His dark eyes were blazing with a volatile mixture of fury and pure terror. "It is not the same thing," he shot back, his voice booming. "Tyler was a sick, insecure coward trying to own you. I am trying to keep you breathing. They tried to take you just to get to me. If they took you, Olivia..." His deep voice broke. He ran a shaking hand through his dark hair. He looked suddenly so old and exhausted. "If they took you, I would burn this entire city to the ground. Millions of innocent people would die." I stepped closer to him. The burning anger was fading. It was being quickly replaced by a deep, aching sadness. "I know you want to protect me," I said softly, reaching out. "But protection cannot ever mean isolation. If I hide in this beautiful penthouse, if I quit my normal job, if I stop taking my design clients, then I am dead anyway. You would just be protecting a ghost. I need to live, Dominic. I need to take up space in the real world." Dominic sank heavily onto the edge of the leather sofa. He rested his elbows on his knees. He dropped his head into his hands. It was the absolute most vulnerable I had ever seen him. "You do not understand," he whispered into the quiet room. "My mother, she was a bright, beautiful, happy thing. She loved to paint landscapes. My father was a brute, a ruthless street thug who built a massive empire on violence and fear. He loved her, but he loved her like a piece of property. He locked her away in a mansion to keep her safe from his enemies. He slowly cut off all her friends. He literally broke her paintbrushes. He told her every day it was for her own good. She died inside that big house long before her heart actually stopped beating." He looked up at me. His dark eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I swore to God I would never be that man. I swore I would never shrink a woman to fit my own insecurities. But tonight, when I saw that man holding you in the alley, all I wanted to do was lock you in a steel vault and throw away the key forever." I sat down right next to him. I took his large, calloused, violent hand in mine. "You are not your father," I told him firmly. "You bought me a laptop. You encouraged me to start my own business. You give me wings, Dominic. Do not clip them now, just because the wind got a little rough." We sat in heavy silence for a long time. The sparkling city of Chicago glittered below us through the glass, oblivious to the deep trauma being unpacked in this room. That is the core of true healing. It is realizing that trauma makes us want to aggressively control our environment. But true, healthy love requires absolute surrender. You have to let the people you love walk out into the world. That is the ultimate lesson in respecting human life and dignity. You cannot protect someone by erasing their autonomy and freedom. Finally, Dominic squeezed my hand tightly. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay. You keep your apartment. You keep your design business. But Anthony drives you absolutely everywhere. No arguments." I smiled, leaning my head on his shoulder. "No arguments. The next few weeks were a beautiful revelation. I officially launched my graphic design business. Dominic handed me a curated list of 10 small businesses. They desperately needed rebranding. They were all legitimate businesses. Local bakeries, auto mechanics, neighborhood flower shops. He did not force them to hire me. He just made the warm introduction. I pitched them and won their contracts on my own merit. I was working until 2 in the morning. I was physically exhausted but completely, emotionally fulfilled. I was finally building my own room in the world. And Tyler, I casually asked Anthony about him one day. Anthony was driving me smoothly to a client meeting downtown. Anthony kept his eyes focused on the road. Tyler tried to cross the state line back into Illinois last week, Anthony said flatly, devoid of emotion. The boss found out immediately. We had a very brief conversation with him at a gas station in Indiana. He surrendered his car, his phone, his shoes. He decided walking to Florida was a much better career move. He will not be coming back to Chicago. I looked out the tinted window. I searched myself. I did not feel guilty. I felt an overwhelming, washing sense of peace. Toxic people will drain your life until you are just an empty shell. Sometimes you need an immovable, terrifying force to break their grip. Dominic was my immovable force. The harsh winter finally gave way to a crisp, bright spring. The golden morning light poured beautifully through the floor to ceiling windows of the penthouse. I was standing in the massive kitchen. I was wearing one of Dominic's oversized, crisp white dress shirts. I was holding a warm mug of coffee. I was watching the sprawling city wake up below me. I had slept here 4 nights this week. It was no longer a secure fortress. It had truly become a home. My phone chimed loudly on the marble counter. It was an email from my biggest corporate client yet. They absolutely loved the final logo design. The large invoice was paid in full. I smiled broadly. I took a slow sip of the hot, bitter coffee. I had actually done it. I was no longer the terrified, shrinking waitress jumping at shadows in the alley. I was a successful business owner. I was a woman who finally knew her own worth. I heard quiet, heavy, familiar footsteps behind me. 2 strong arms wrapped securely around my waist. Dominic pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the curve of my neck. He smelled like expensive soap, and the faint, metallic scent of gunpowder. It was a complex scent I had learned to associate with absolute, unwavering safety. Good news. His low, gravelly voice rumbled against my skin. The best, I replied happily. I leaned back comfortably into his solid chest. They loved the design. You are currently looking at the newest rising star in Chicago's branding world. I could feel his proud smile against my neck. I never doubted it for a single second, he murmured. He turned me around gently to face him. He was already fully dressed for his day. A sharp, bespoke black suit, a dark silk tie, a leather holster strapped across his broad chest. The cold black metal of his gun peeked out ominously from under the tailored jacket. It was always a jarring contrast. The beautiful, peaceful, domestic morning, and the dark, violent, ruthless reality of his daily life. But I did not flinch. I reached out and carefully adjusted his tie. I smoothed the expensive silk with my fingers. People always think love is supposed to be easy. They think it is supposed to be safe and predictable. But I learned the hard way. The men who promise you perfect safety are usually the exact ones secretly building the cage. Tyler constantly promised me a safe world, but he made my world so incredibly small I could not breathe. Dominic lived entirely in a dangerous world of wolves. He was the biggest, most lethal wolf of them all, but he stood firmly at the door of my life, and he faced outward. He never once turned his teeth on me. He gave me space, he gave me profound respect. He gave me the ultimate choice to stay or to run. When you give a victim the absolute freedom to leave, that is exactly the moment when they finally find a real reason to stay. I reached up and gently traced the faint scar on his strong jawline. Be careful out there today, I whispered. He promised solemnly. He leaned down and captured my lips. It was not a desperate, controlling, hungry kiss. It was deep. It was grounding. It was full of mutual, undeniable respect. He pulled back slowly. His dark, dangerous eyes locked onto mine. He looked down at the faint, silver scar on my wrist, the only physical reminder of Tyler that remained on my body. Dominic lifted my hand gently. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss right over the scar tissue. It was a silent promise, a vow that no one would ever shrink me again as long as he drew breath. He turned and walked confidently toward the private elevator. The metal doors slid open. He looked back at me one last time. The ruthless Mafia boss who had bowed down to a waitress. Then the doors closed, taking him back down into the violent shadows of the city. I turned back to the window. The spring sun warmed my face. Toxic love aggressively chokes you in a tiny box. It constantly tells you that you are too weak to fly. But my devil, my beautiful, terrifying, protective devil, He was entirely willing to burn down the entire world, just to clear the runway for me to take off. And as I confidently opened my laptop to start a brand new day, I knew with absolute certainty I would choose this dangerous, beautiful, liberating freedom every single time. So, if you ever find yourself shrinking just to fit into someone else's narrow world, stop, run until you find the person who demands you take up space. The one who looks at your fire and hands you more fuel. That is where life actually begins. That is where you truly learn how to breathe. The next morning felt completely different. I woke up to the sound of city traffic, not the sound of my own racing heartbeat. I made a pot of cheap coffee. I cleared off my tiny kitchen table. I carefully took the sleek black laptop out of its box. I opened the lid. The screen lit up instantly. It was completely blank. It was an empty canvas waiting for me to finally speak. I downloaded my graphic design software. I did not have to hide the icons in secret folders anymore. I did not have to quickly close the screen when someone walked into the room. Tyler used to randomly check my browser history. He said he just wanted to make sure I was not looking at other men. But he was actually making sure I was not looking at job boards. He was making sure I was not looking at a way out. I sat at that kitchen table for 8 straight hours. I drank 4 cups of black coffee. I designed 3 different logo concepts for Dominic's logistics company. I used sharp, clean lines. I used bold, industrial colors. I poured every single ounce of my suppressed creativity into the digital canvas. I was exhausted by the time the sun went down. My eyes were burning. My back was incredibly stiff. But I felt alive. I felt completely, genuinely alive for the first time in years. I printed the mock-ups on high-quality paper. I put them in a crisp black folder. I took them to Vincenzo's for my evening shift. Dominic was sitting at table 12. He was wearing a dark gray suit. He was reading his leather-bound notebook. I walked over and placed the black folder directly on the white tablecloth. He looked up. He closed his notebook slowly. He opened the folder. He studied the designs in complete silence. He looked at the first page, then the second, then the third. My stomach tied itself into tight, nervous knots. I was terrified he would hate them. I was terrified he would tell me I was actually a terrible artist. But he did not. He looked up at me. His dark eyes were burning with intense, quiet pride. These are exceptional. Olivia, his voice was a deep, steady rumble. You understand exactly what my company needs. You understand the sharp edge of the business. I want to buy the second concept. I will have my accountant wire your full fee tomorrow morning. I stood there completely frozen. I had actually done it. I had sold my very first professional design. I was no longer just a struggling waitress. I was a working graphic designer. Thank you, I whispered. My voice was shaking slightly. Dominic closed the black folder. He set his large hand flat on top of it. Do not thank me for recognizing your actual talent. I am a businessman. I pay for quality work. You did the heavy lifting. You built this. I walked back to the busy kitchen. I leaned against the cool metal of the refrigerator. I closed my eyes and took a very deep breath. Healing is not a magical, overnight process. It is a series of tiny, successful moments. It is realizing you can actually stand on your own 2 feet. The following weeks were a beautiful, chaotic blur of hard work. I officially launched Mitchell Design. It was just me in my tiny apartment, but it felt like a massive empire. Dominic quietly recommended me to 3 more local business owners: a high-end bakery, a neighborhood auto shop, a boutique hotel downtown. He did not force them to hire me. He explicitly told them to interview me like any other contractor. I had to pitch my portfolio. I had to negotiate my own rates. I won all 3 contracts on my own merit. I started making real substantial money. I officially cut my waitressing shifts down to 3 nights a week. The manager at Vincenzo's actually hugged me when I told him. He said he always knew I was meant for bigger things. Every time I cashed a client check, the invisible, suffocating chains of my past broke a little more. Financial abuse is the silent killer in domestic violence. They drain your bank accounts, so you cannot afford a taxi to escape. They sabotage your jobs, so you have to beg them for grocery money. Dominic handed me the powerful tools to build my own financial fortress. He gave me absolute independence. And strangely, that terrifying independence made me want to get closer to him. Our relationship started to slowly shift. It moved away from the quiet table in the corner of the restaurant. He started waiting for me after my shifts ended. We would walk slowly along the freezing Chicago lakefront. The brutal wind whipped my hair across my face. His large, warm hand would gently guide me away from the icy edge. We talked about everything. We talked about art. We talked about the brutal history of the city. We talked about our deepest, darkest fears. He told me he was terrified of losing his humanity. He told me the criminal underworld requires you to be a ruthless monster. He said he fought every single day to keep a tiny piece of his soul intact. I told him he was the most human man I had ever met, because monsters do not ask for permission. Monsters do not listen when you say no. Dominic always listened, he always asked. One night, standing under a flickering street lamp outside my apartment, he finally kissed me. It was not a sudden aggressive move. He stepped close to me. He looked deeply into my eyes. He waited for my physical cue. I reached up and grabbed the lapels of his heavy wool coat. I pulled him down to me. The kiss was slow. It was deep. It was incredibly grounding. It tasted like expensive whiskey and absolute safety. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine. His breathing was slightly uneven. He carefully searched my face for any signs of panic. There was no panic. There was only a burning, undeniable desire. I was falling in love with a mafia boss. It was the most dangerous, illogical thing I had ever done. But it was also the most honest thing I had ever felt. But you cannot fall in love with the devil without eventually smelling the sulfur. The peaceful illusion of our late-night walks did not last. The brutal reality of Chicago's underworld started bleeding rapidly into my life. I started noticing the terrifying shifts in the atmosphere. The number of massive men in dark suits around the restaurant doubled almost overnight. They stood like silent statues in the shadows. Anthony Greco was always there. He never smiled anymore. His hand was always resting suspiciously near the inside of his tailored jacket. Dominic stopped reading his journal at table 12. He was constantly taking hushed, aggressive phone calls in rapid Italian. The thick vein in his jaw throbbed constantly. The quiet, protective wolf was actively preparing for a bloody war. He rented out a small, incredibly expensive Italian cafe one Tuesday night, just the two of us. The entire restaurant was completely empty. There were 4 heavily armed men standing outside the front doors. We sat at a small wooden table in the back. He did not order any food. He poured 2 glasses of red wine. He looked at me with a completely unreadable expression. "We need to talk about the reality of my life," he said softly. His deep voice carried a heavy, terrifying weight. "A rival organization from down south is aggressively pushing into my territory. They are called the Cartel Dello. They are completely ruthless. They do not follow the old, established rules of this city. They kill civilians. They bomb businesses. They are actively looking for any leverage to break my grip on the south side." He paused. He took a slow sip of his dark wine. His eyes locked onto mine. "And they know exactly who you are, Livia. They know you are my only bleeding weakness." My heart stopped completely dead in my chest. A freezing chill ran straight down my spine. The pathetic, psychological ghost of Tyler was absolutely nothing compared to this. This was real, organized, heavily armed violence. This was the terrifying cost of loving a king. "I am significantly increasing your security detail," Dominic stated. It was not a request. It was an absolute, non-negotiable command. "You will not walk alone anymore. You will not take the public subway. You will ride in my armored cars. You will stay highly alert. Anthony will be with you whenever I cannot be." I stared at him across the table. I saw the raw primal fear hiding deep behind his cold, calculating eyes. He was terrified of losing me. I nodded slowly. I trusted his judgment. I trusted his protection. But the invisible cage was slowly starting to close around me again. It was a different kind of cage. It was built of bulletproof glass and armed guards, but it still felt like losing my hard-won freedom. The violent explosion happened exactly 4 days later. It was a freezing Thursday night. The sky was dumping heavy, wet snow onto the city. I was finishing a grueling double shift at Vincenzo's. I was exhausted. I was taking the heavy black trash bags out to the back alley. It was a simple, completely mindless daily chore. I pushed open the heavy metal back door. The alley was pitch black. The single security light above the door was smashed. It smelled strongly of wet cardboard and rotting garlic. I threw the heavy bags loudly into the rusted metal dumpster. I turned around to walk quickly back inside the warm kitchen. There was absolutely no sound. There was absolutely no warning. Just a sudden, violent displacement of the freezing night air. A heavy, thick, leather-gloved hand clamped brutally over my mouth. The rough leather tasted like dirt and gun grease. A massive, muscular arm wrapped incredibly tight around my waist. I was lifted entirely off the cold, wet ground. I kicked wildly at the air. I thrashed like a wild animal. The primal, suffocating terror was absolute. I tried to scream, but the sound was completely swallowed by the heavy glove. 2 huge men were dragging me rapidly toward a rusted, unmarked van idling quietly in the dark shadows. They spoke in rapid, hushed-beat Spanish. They were professional. They were efficient. I was going to disappear forever. Then the silent, snowy night completely exploded. It was a deafening, echoing, terrifying crack of heavy gunfire. The man holding me jerked violently forward. His iron grip vanished instantly. I hit the wet, freezing pavement incredibly hard. I scraped my knees completely raw on the cold concrete. I scrambled desperately on my hands and knees. I dove under the filthy metal dumpster. I curled into a tiny, shaking ball. I pressed my hands forcefully over my ears. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut. The pitch-black alley lit up brightly with rapid, strobe-like muzzle flashes. It was absolute terrifying. Sensory chaos. Men were shouting angry, aggressive orders in English and Spanish. Heavy bullets were tearing massive chunks of red brick out of the alley walls. The sound was deafening. It vibrated right through my bones. It lasted for exactly 40 agonizing seconds, then total, ringing silence. The silence was almost worse than the gunfire. I stayed curled under the dumpster. I was hyperventilating. I was waiting for someone to drag me out by my hair. Then I heard heavy, frantic footsteps running rapidly toward me. Olivia, the voice was raw. It was broken. It was completely torn to shreds. It was Dominic. He dropped heavily to his knees right in the filthy, freezing slush of the alley. His expensive, custom black suit was completely ruined. His broad chest was heaving uncontrollably. He reached under the dirty dumpster. He grabbed my shoulders. He dragged me fiercely out into the cold air. He wrapped his strong, shaking arms around me, so incredibly tightly I could barely breathe. He was visibly trembling. The ruthless, untouchable, terrifying king of Chicago was shaking like a fragile, dying leaf. He buried his face deep into my freezing neck. "I got you," he choked out. His deep voice was wet with unshed tears. "I got you." I opened my eyes slowly. I looked over his broad shoulder. The alley was a literal war zone. There were 3 bodies lying motionless on the ground. The pristine white snow was stained bright, horrific red. The brutal, unforgiving reality of his violent world was right in front of my eyes. This was not a movie, this was real death. But as I clung desperately to his ruined jacket, smelling the sharp metallic tang of gunpowder, mixed with his expensive cologne, I realized a profound, life-altering truth. I was not running away in terror. I was actively, consciously holding on to him tighter. We had a massive, terrifying argument that exact same night. We stood in the very center of his sprawling, glass-walled penthouse. The adrenaline from the alley shootout was still pumping violently through our veins. "You are moving in here tonight," Dominic roared. He was pacing the hardwood floor like a caged, furious panther. "You are never going back to that rundown apartment. You are not working at that restaurant ever again. You will stay here behind my walls. I will put a massive wall of guns and 100 men between you and the rest of the city." I stood my ground. My hands were still shaking violently from the attack, but my voice was surprisingly, incredibly steady. "No," I yelled back at him. "I will not do it. I will not trade one miserable cage for another." Tyler locked me away because he said the outside world was too dangerous. "You are trying to do the exact same thing to me." Dominic stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at me. His dark eyes were blazing with a volatile, terrifying mixture of fury and pure terror. "It is not the same thing." He shot back, his voice booming through the empty penthouse. "Tyler was a sick, insecure coward trying to own you. I am trying to keep your heart beating. They tried to take you tonight, just to get leverage on me. If they took you, Olivia..." His deep voice suddenly broke. He ran a shaking hand aggressively through his dark hair. He looked suddenly so incredibly old and exhausted. "If they took you, I would burn this entire city to the ground. Millions of innocent people would die in the crossfire." I stepped closer to him. The burning anger inside me was rapidly fading. It was being quickly replaced by a deep, aching sadness. "I know you want to protect me," I said softly. I reached out and gently touched his chest. "But protection cannot ever mean complete isolation. If I hide in this beautiful glass penthouse, if I quit my normal job, if I stop taking my design clients, then I am dead anyway. I am just a ghost haunting your expensive house. You would just be protecting a ghost. I need to live, Dominic. I need to take up space in the real world." Dominic sank heavily onto the edge of the expensive leather sofa. He rested his elbows on his knees. He dropped his head deeply into his calloused hands. It was the absolute most vulnerable I had ever seen him. He was a king stripped completely of his armor. "You do not understand," he whispered into the quiet room. "My mother, she was a bright, beautiful, happy thing. She loved to paint large, colorful landscapes. My father was a brute. He was a ruthless street thug who built a massive empire on violence and pure fear. He loved her, but he loved her exactly like a piece of property. He locked her away in a massive mansion to keep her safe from his many enemies. He slowly cut off all her friends. He literally broke her paintbrushes. He told her every single day it was for her own good. She died inside that big house long before her heart actually stopped beating." He looked up at me. His dark eyes were bright with unshed, Ancient tears. I swore to God I would never be that man. I swore I would never shrink a woman to fit my own massive insecurities. But tonight, when I saw that man holding you in the alley, all I wanted to do was lock you in a heavy steel vault and throw away the key forever. The darkest part of my soul wanted to own your safety. I sat down right next to him. I took his large, calloused, violent hand in mine. This is the exact moment trauma heals. It heals when you drag the darkest, ugliest parts of yourself into the light and ask someone to hold them. I held his hand tightly. You are not your father. I told him firmly. You bought me a laptop. You encouraged me to start my own graphic design business. You gave me my wings, Dominic. Do not brutally clip them now, just because the wind got a little rough. We sat in heavy, profound silence for a very long time. The sparkling city of Chicago glittered below us through the massive glass windows. It was completely oblivious to the deep, generational trauma being unpacked in this quiet room. Finally, Dominic squeezed my hand tightly. Okay, he said quietly. His voice was resigned but completely honest. Okay, you keep your apartment. You keep your design business. But Anthony drives you absolutely everywhere. And you carry a tracker in your purse. No arguments. I smiled softly. I leaned my tired head on his broad shoulder. No arguments. Respecting a strict boundary is the ultimate, highest form of human love. It is realizing you cannot control the dangerous world, but you can choose to face it entirely together. The brutal Chicago winter had completely surrendered to a blindingly bright summer. My graphic design business did not just grow slowly over those warm months. It completely exploded. I had officially hired 3 full-time employees. We were working out of a stunning, sunlit loft space right in the middle of downtown. I was no longer taking small, local neighborhood jobs just to pay my basic utility bills. I was actively pitching my creative vision to massive, international corporations. I sat at my large glass desk and looked around my beautiful office. I remembered the terrified, exhausted girl crying silently in the cramped staff bathroom at Vincenzo's. She felt like a completely different person. She felt like a sad ghost I had finally laid to rest forever. Tyler used to aggressively mock my ambitions every single day. He used to laugh cruelly at my design sketches. He told me I was living in a pathetic, childish fantasy world. He wanted me completely dependent on his meager paycheck. He made sure I could never afford to walk out the front door. Financial abuse is the silent, invisible chain that keeps so many victims trapped in the dark. It strips away your basic ability to survive on your own. But Dominic actively handed me the heavy bolt cutters. He never once offered to just pay my rent. He knew that would just be another shiny, comfortable cage. Instead, he simply introduced me to the right people. He stepped back completely. He let my actual talent do all the heavy lifting. One Tuesday morning, I sat in a massive corporate boardroom. I signed a multi-million-dollar rebranding contract with a luxury international hotel chain. My hand did not shake at all. I walked out of that glass building and took a deep breath of the city air. I hung up the phone with my accountant and literally cried hot tears of pure, unadulterated relief. I was entirely self-sufficient. I was a creative powerhouse. Healing is not about completely erasing your painful past. It is about building a present so massive and beautiful that the past simply cannot cast a shadow over it anymore. I had finally built my own impenetrable fortress. That exact same evening, Dominic came directly to my new office. He was wearing a sharp, custom navy blue suit. He stood quietly in the open doorway. He did not interrupt my phone call. He just watched me pack up my sleek laptop. His dark, dangerous eyes were shining with intense, quiet pride. I heard the incredibly good news. He rumbled softly, his deep, steady voice vibrated through the large, empty room. He walked over slowly and gently kissed my forehead. To celebrate your massive victory properly, we are going out this Saturday night. Not to a quiet, hidden Italian restaurant in the South Side. We are going to the mayor's annual charity gala. My heart immediately skipped a massive, terrifying beat. The gala was the biggest, most highly publicized social event in the entire city. There would be hundreds of flashing cameras. There would be aggressive, shouting reporters. Dominic had always kept his violent private life strictly in the absolute darkest shadows. Taking me to the gala meant officially stepping into the blinding public light. It meant declaring to the entire brutal city that I was his equal partner. It meant permanently tying my clean, hard-earned corporate image to his dark, violent mafia reputation. I looked up into his intense, dark eyes. Are you absolutely sure about this? I asked softly. It will put a massive, public target on my back. He reached out and gently traced my jawline with his rough, calloused thumb. The cartel is completely gone. Olivia, the city knows exactly what happens if anyone even looks at you wrong. I am not hiding you anymore. Tyler kept you locked in the dark because he was deeply ashamed of his own pathetic weakness. I want to stand in the brightest light possible, cause I am incredibly proud of your massive strength. But the choice is entirely yours. I will never drag you anywhere you do not absolutely want to go. I realized then that true love always leaves the door wide open. I took a deep, steadying breath. I nodded slowly. Okay, let us go show the world exactly who we are. Saturday night arrived in a chaotic, nervous blur of pure adrenaline. I bought a stunning, floor-length emerald green silk gown. It was incredibly elegant. It was undeniably powerful. It was paid for entirely with my own hard-earned corporate money. I did not want to look like a mobster's kept woman. I wanted to look exactly like a CEO. I walked out of the massive penthouse master bathroom. Dominic was waiting patiently by the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. He was wearing a flawless, classic black tuxedo. He looked absolutely lethal. He looked like a dark, violent prince stepping out of a bloody fairy tale. He turned around when he heard my tall heels clicking on the polished hardwood floor. He completely froze. He actually stopped breathing for 3 full seconds. His dark eyes slowly and hungrily swept over my entire body. You look absolutely magnificent, he whispered. His deep voice was rough and incredibly thick with raw emotion. We rode down to the massive downtown hotel, in the quiet back of his heavy armored SUV. He held my hand tightly the entire way. The heavy car pulled up smoothly to the bright, chaotic red carpet. The flashing camera lights were absolutely blinding. The loud, aggressive shouting of the desperate paparazzi was deafening. The heavy car door swung open. The cold night air hit my flushed face. Dominic stepped out first. The entire screaming crowd seemed to instantly quiet down. The dark, terrifying power he naturally commanded was a tangible, physical force. He turned around smoothly and offered me his large, scarred hand. I did not hesitate for a single second. I placed my trembling hand firmly in his. I stepped out of the dark, safe car and completely into the glaring light. I kept my chin held incredibly high. I did not shrink nervously behind his broad shoulders. I walked right beside him as his absolute equal. Wealthy people were whispering furiously behind their manicured hands. Powerful politicians were nervously stepping completely out of our way. We commanded the entire space without saying a single word. The crowded gala was loud, incredibly opulent, and filled with fake, plastic smiles. We were standing near a massive, glittering crystal chandelier. I was sipping a glass of expensive, ice-cold champagne. Dominic was talking quietly to a very nervous, sweating city alderman. A group of wealthy, older corporate executives walked confidently over to us. They looked at me with clear, thinly veiled disdain. They thought I was just another pretty, helpless, brainless accessory hanging on the arm of a terrifying mafia boss. One of the men, a highly arrogant billionaire real estate developer, smirked at me. So Olivia. He said my name like it was a cheap, dirty joke. What exactly does a pretty girl like you do to pass the time, while Dominic handles the real, serious business of the city? 2 brutal years ago, that condescending, sexist question would have completely crushed me. I would have stammered pathetically. I would have blushed bright red. I would have looked desperately at the marble floor. But that terrified, broken girl was completely dead and permanently buried. I looked the arrogant billionaire right in his cold, gray eyes. I did not blink. I smiled a sharp, cold, completely lethal smile. I just finalized a massive, multi-million-dollar rebranding contract for the Grand Continental Hotel Group. I believe that is the exact same hotel group that just publicly rejected your massive, desperate real estate bid last week. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my expensive champagne. So, to answer your condescending question, I passed the time by actually closing the massive deals you clearly cannot. The billionaire's smug face instantly turned bright, angry, purple-red. He choked violently on his expensive scotch. He sputtered helplessly, trying frantically to find a clever, biting comeback, but he had absolutely nothing. The other wealthy executives stared at me in total, stunned silence. Dominic stepped forward. He did not introduce me merely as his beautiful girlfriend. This is Olivia Mitchell, the CEO of Mitchell Design, he said loudly, and she is the most ruthless, brilliant person in this entire room. Later that exact evening, we stood together on the quiet, windy terrace of his glass penthouse. The massive, beautiful Chicago skyline was glittering brightly far below us. Dominic walked up quietly behind me. He wrapped his massive, heavy arms tightly around my waist. He rested his rough chin gently on my bare shoulder. You completely owned that entire ballroom tonight. His deep voice rumbled warmly against my back. You took your power back from every single person, whoever made you feel small. I leaned back comfortably into his rock-solid chest. I did. I realized I do not have to be terrified of the old ghosts anymore. You taught me how to firmly stand my ground. Dominic kissed the soft side of my neck. I did not teach you anything, Olivia. I just held the heavy shield while you remembered exactly how incredibly strong you always were. Love is not ever supposed to be a tight, suffocating dark box. It is not supposed to make you constantly question your own sanity or your own profound worth. If someone aggressively monitors your phone, they do not actually love you. They simply want to own you. If someone aggressively isolates you from the world, they are not protecting you. They are intentionally trapping you. I had to walk barefoot through absolute psychological hell to learn the massive difference between toxic possession and fierce protection. Toxic love violently shrinks you until you completely disappear into the quiet background of your own miserable life. Real healthy love hands you a heavy, sharpened sword. It stands proudly by your side while you violently conquer your own beautiful world. Dominic Lombardi was a ruthless, terrifying mafia boss. He was a man steeped heavily in brutal violence, thick blood, and dark shadows. But he was the very first person to ever turn on the bright, blinding light in my life. He showed me that true, profound human respect means giving someone the absolute, terrifying freedom to walk away. And in that beautiful, terrifying freedom, I finally found my permanent, impenetrable home. I turned around smoothly in his strong arms. I looked up into his dark, intense, beautiful eyes. I pulled him down for a deep, grounding, passionate kiss. I was completely done apologizing for taking up space. I was finally truly ready to fly. The blinding success of my agency inevitably attracted very dangerous sharks. Power always violently attracts new challengers. You cannot stand in the bright light without casting a very dark shadow. 3 months after the gala, my business hit a sudden, brutal brick wall. We took on a massive, highly publicized project. It was for a very aggressive tech billionaire named Marcus Vance. He was building a massive new software empire. He desperately wanted top-tier, luxury branding. We delivered exceptional, flawless work. We hit every single deadline perfectly. My team worked for weeks without sleep to make it happen. But when I sent the final invoice for $200,000, he completely ignored it. A week passed in total silence, then 2 agonizing weeks. I called his private office every single day. His arrogant secretary just laughed and hung up the phone. It was incredibly frustrating. Finally, he requested a private meeting. I walked confidently into his massive, cold glass office downtown. He did not stand up to greet me. He did not even offer me a comfortable chair. He just looked at me like I was a naive, stupid little girl playing a silly business game. He leaned back arrogantly in his expensive leather chair. He smiled a sick, deeply familiar smile. He told me flatly he was not going to pay the massive invoice at all. He said my boutique agency was far too small to afford a lengthy, bruising legal battle against his massive corporation. He said I should just accept a tiny fraction of the money and be incredibly grateful he paid me anything. It was the exact same toxic psychological warfare Tyler used to play. It was the classic, pathetic manipulation of a powerful man trying to crush a woman just because he could. He desperately wanted me to feel incredibly small. He wanted me to desperately beg for my own hard-earned money. I did not beg him for a single penny. I simply stood up, adjusted my expensive blazer, and walked right out of his cold glass office. I drove back to the penthouse that evening, in total, heavy silence. I was absolutely boiling with a cold, righteous anger. I practically kicked the heavy front door open. Dominic was sitting peacefully in the living room, reading a heavy leather-bound book. He took one single look at my furious face and closed the book instantly. The highly protective, lethal mafia boss woke up immediately. His dark eyes narrowed into dangerous, terrifying slits. The temperature in the large room seemed to drop 20 degrees. He asked me exactly what happened. I did not hold anything back. I told him every single infuriating detail of the terrible meeting with Marcus Vance. I told him about the massive unpaid invoice. I told him about the arrogant, condescending smile. I told him how Vance tried to make me feel completely powerless and small. Dominic stood up very slowly. His sharp jaw was locked incredibly tight. The thick vein in his neck was throbbing visibly. He reached quickly into his suit jacket for his ringing cell phone. He did not yell or throw things. He spoke in that terrifying, deadly whisper I knew so well. I will have Anthony pay Mr. Vance a quiet, educational visit tonight, Dominic stated flatly. He will happily write you a massive check by tomorrow morning. He will desperately beg for your absolute forgiveness before the sun even comes up. It was so incredibly tempting. It would be so incredibly easy to just nod my head and let him do it. I could let the dark, violent underworld quickly solve all my corporate problems. I could let my terrifying boyfriend completely crush my arrogant enemies. But I took a deep breath. I reached out and gently grabbed his large hand. I firmly pulled the cell phone right out of his long fingers. No, I said firmly. I cannot ever let you do that. Dominic looked at me in genuine, absolute confusion. He crossed his massive arms over his broad chest. He is aggressively stealing from you. Olivia, he growled softly. He is completely disrespecting your hard work and your absolute brilliance. I violently protect what is mine in this city. I looked deeply into his dark, furious eyes. I am yours. But this creative company is entirely mine. I replied softly but firmly. If you send Anthony to violently threaten him in the dark, I am no better than Marcus. I am just hiding cowardly behind a bigger, scarier man to get what I want. Tyler always fought my battles, just to keep me weak and entirely dependent on his protection. You have to let me fight this specific battle, entirely by myself to keep me strong. Dominic stared at me in heavy, loaded silence for a very long time. The deeply ingrained, primal instinct to violently protect his partners was warring fiercely with his deep respect for my personal independence. That is the ultimate grueling test of a truly healthy relationship. It is entirely suppressing your own desperate need to quickly fix things. It is simply trusting your partner to handle their own complicated life. Finally, he slowly put the cell phone down on the heavy glass table. He took a deep, heavy breath. He nodded just once. Okay, he rumbled softly. How are you going to absolutely destroy him? A cold, highly confident smile spread slowly across my face. I spent the entire night wide awake at the marble kitchen island. I meticulously gathered every single electronic email. I printed every signed corporate contract. I transcribed every recorded Zoom meeting. I called the absolute smartest, most aggressive corporate lawyer in Chicago at 6 a.m. I paid his massive retainer in full without blinking. The very next morning, I walked right back into Marcus Vance's towering glass building. I did not come alone this time. I brought my ruthless, sharp-suited lawyer and a massive stack of undeniable legal evidence. I walked straight past his terrified, stammering secretary. I pushed open the heavy oak doors to his private office without knocking. Marcus looked up in absolute shock. I threw the heavy black legal binder forcefully onto his pristine desk. The loud, sharp smack echoed loudly through the large room. I kept my voice incredibly calm, cold, and entirely professional. You have exactly 24 hours to wire the full amount, plus my lawyer's extremely expensive fees. I stated clearly, if the entire sum is not in my corporate account by tomorrow morning, I am taking this completely public. I will personally send this exact evidence binder to every single tech journalist in the entire city. I will completely and utterly ruin your upcoming public stock offering. Marcus turned the color of dirty, wet ash. His arrogant, condescending smile completely vanished from his face. He looked nervously at the thick binder. He looked at my unsmiling lawyer. Then he looked at my entirely unapologetic, fierce face. He realized instantly that he had massively underestimated the wrong woman. The massive wire transfer hit my business bank account at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning. It included every single penny he owed me, plus a ridiculous amount of extra money for the severe legal fees. He even sent a pathetic, formal email, deeply apologizing for the unfortunate administrative oversight. I sat at my sleek desk and stared at the glowing green numbers on the screen. I felt a massive rushing wave of pure, unadulterated power. I did not use a loaded gun. I did not use illegal, Mafia intimidation. I used my own brilliant mind and my own unbreakable boundaries. I drove back to the glass penthouse that evening, feeling 10 feet tall. Dominic was standing quietly on the outdoor terrace. He was watching the dark, glittering city below. I walked out into the cool autumn air. I wrapped my arms tightly around his waist from behind. I rested my cheek gently against his broad, solid back, the money completely cleared. I whispered happily into the wind, every single penny. Dominic turned around slowly. He looked down at me with an expression of pure, absolute awe. It was not the fiercely protective look he used to give the terrified waitress. It was the deep, profound look of a dark king, staring directly at his equal queen. You are absolutely terrifying, he murmured smoothly. He reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of hair behind my ear. I am incredibly proud of you. Olivia, you did not even need me to save you today. I smiled up at him. I leaned my head securely against his chest. I listened to the steady, calming beat of his heart. I do not need you to save me anymore, I corrected him softly. I need you to stand firmly beside me while I aggressively save myself. There is a massive, fundamental difference. He wrapped his heavy arms tightly around my shoulders. He kissed the top of my head. Yes, there is, he agreed quietly. That is the beautiful, absolute truth about profound healing. When you are deeply traumatized, you constantly look for a powerful savior. You look for someone to violently pull you out of the dark, freezing water. You falsely think romantic love means finding someone who will fight every single battle for you, but that kind of total dependency always turns into another heavy, suffocating cage. Tyler convinced me I was too weak to survive the cruel world alone, but the greatest, most profound lesson I ever learned came from a terrifying, violent mafia boss. Dominic did not permanently shield me from the harsh world. He handed me back my own stolen power. He stood patiently by the door and proudly watched me become my own fierce protector. Healthy love absolutely demands that you become incredibly strong. It demands that you take up massive space. I am no longer a terrified, broken girl running desperately from a monster. I am a strong, unbroken woman standing proudly, right next to one. And for the very first time in my entire life, I am completely, beautifully, and unapologetically free. The victory over Marcus Vance was a massive turning point. I did not just win a highly lucrative corporate contract that day. I won a completely new version of myself. Trauma does a terrible thing to your human brain. It aggressively wires you to constantly expect failure. It wires you to deeply believe you are entirely helpless in a cruel world. But standing up to Marcus physically and mentally rewired my entire mind. I woke up the very next morning feeling incredibly light. I drove to my large sunlit office downtown. I looked at my dedicated employees typing away at their sleek desks. I realized I had successfully built a very safe, thriving ecosystem. But massive financial success can sometimes feel strangely hollow if you do not actively share it. I sat behind my sleek glass desk. I thought about the thousands of terrified women still trapped in dark rooms across the city. I thought about the broken women who did not have a powerful Dominic to step in. They did not have someone like Anthony driving a heavy armored SUV to rescue them. They were fighting brutal monsters completely alone in the dark. I made a massive, life-altering corporate decision right there. I called my senior leadership team immediately into the boardroom. I announced the aggressive creation of a brand new, fully funded pro bono division. We were going to offer free, top-tier branding and career rebuilding services. We were going to specifically target and help women escaping domestic violence. I wanted to personally hand them the exact same heavy bolt cutters Dominic had handed me. I wanted to teach them exactly how to build their own impenetrable financial fortresses. When I told Dominic about the new foundation that night, he did not hesitate for a single second. He did not tell me it was far too dangerous to get involved with violent men. He simply asked for the new foundation's exact bank account, routing number. He quietly wired a massive, anonymous 7-figure donation. It funded our first entire year completely. He did not ask for his name on the building. He did not ask for public credit. That is exactly what absolute, profound respect looks like in a true partnership. He actively funded my personal war because he fiercely believed in my absolute right to fight it. The very first woman to cautiously walk through our foundation doors was named Sarah. She was only 22 years old. She looked exactly like a fragile, completely broken bird. She wore a heavy, thick, oversized gray sweater. She wore it specifically to hide the ugly, deep purple bruises wrapping around her thin arms. She jumped violently every single time a heavy office door closed down the hallway. I brought her quietly into my private, secure office. I poured her a warm, soothing cup of herbal tea. I did not give her a generic, useless corporate motivational speech. I looked right into her terrified, exhausted, bloodshot eyes. I told her the absolute, brutal truth about my own dark past. I told her about Tyler constantly checking my phone while I was in the shower. I told her about the suffocating panic attacks on the cold bathroom floor. I watched the profound, undeniable shock wash completely over her pale face. She looked at my expensive tailored suit and my confident posture. She could not believe I was ever violently trapped in the exact same dark cage. That is the incredible, profound healing power of shared human vulnerability. It completely shatters the heavy, toxic shame of domestic abuse. I told Sarah very clearly that her abuser was not a powerful god. He was just a deeply pathetic, insecure, weak coward. I promised her we would help her completely rebuild her shattered resume. We would teach her modern design software. We would help her quietly find a safe, highly secure job. We would make her completely, undeniably financially independent. Financial independence is the sharpest sword you can hand a victim. Over the next 3 long months, I watched a beautiful miracle slowly happen right in my office. I watched Sarah slowly stop flinching at sudden movements. I watched her hunched posture straighten up with new pride. I watched the bright, beautiful light slowly return to her dark eyes. Healing is never just about aggressively saving yourself and running away. True, profound healing is taking a bright, blazing torch and walking right back into the pitch-black cave. It is fiercely guiding the next terrified person out into the warm sun. But abusive. Toxic men never let go of their absolute control easily. They aggressively and violently hunt down their escaping victims. Exactly 4 months later, the brutal reality of Sarah's dark past crashed directly into my safe corporate office. It was a very busy, loud Tuesday afternoon. Sarah's furious, estranged ex-husband somehow bypassed the strict downstairs lobby security guards. He burst violently and aggressively through my heavy glass office doors. He was a large, imposing, incredibly angry man. He was screaming horrific, violent threats at the top of his lungs. He pointed a thick, trembling, aggressive finger directly at my face. He demanded to know exactly where Sarah was currently hiding. He aggressively threatened to completely burn my entire beautiful company right down to the ground. 2 brutal years ago, a large man screaming violently in my face would have paralyzed me completely. I would have instantly dissolved into a pathetic puddle of absolute terror. I would have cried and desperately begged him to leave. But I did not flinch. I did not even blink my eyes. I sat perfectly calmly behind my expansive, heavy glass desk. I looked directly at his sweaty, red, screaming face. He looked so incredibly weak, small and pathetic to me now. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I reached slowly and deliberately under my desk. I pressed the silent, direct emergency panic button. I leaned forward slowly, resting my elbows comfortably on the cold glass surface. I looked him dead in his dark, angry, toxic eyes. I told him he had exactly 30 seconds to walk out of my building before his life permanently and violently changed. The heavy glass doors directly behind him opened very smoothly. Anthony Greco stepped quietly into my office like a massive, silent shadow. Anthony did not draw a heavy weapon. He did not yell a single word. He just placed a massive, incredibly heavy hand firmly on the man's shaking shoulder. The furious husband instantly turned completely, sickly white. He recognized exactly who Anthony worked for in this brutal city. He turned around instantly and literally ran for the elevators. He never bothered Sarah or my agency ever again. I realized right then that I was no longer a victim surviving a terrifying storm. I was the absolute, undeniable storm itself. I went home to the massive glass penthouse that evening, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace. I finally told Dominic exactly what had happened with Sarah's furious ex-husband. I expected him to be furiously, explosively angry. I expected him to yell aggressively about my compromised personal safety. I expected him to immediately and aggressively double my armed security detail. But he did absolutely none of those controlling things. He stood very quietly by the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering, dark city. He slowly poured 2 glasses of expensive, very dark whiskey. He walked over and gently handed me a heavy, cold crystal glass. He touched his glass very softly against mine. It made a sharp, clear, incredibly beautiful sound in the quiet room. He took a slow, measured sip. He looked at me with an expression I will never, ever forget as long as I live. It was a look of pure, absolute, unadulterated human reverence. "You are building an incredible, unstoppable army of strong women," he murmured deeply. "You are violently pulling them right out of the freezing dark. You are vastly more powerful than any ruthless crime boss in this entire brutal city." He slowly set his heavy glass down on the smooth marble counter. He reached slowly and deliberately into his tailored suit jacket. He did not drop dramatically to one knee like a cheesy movie. He did not make a huge, overwhelming, stressful cinematic spectacle. He just opened a very small, simple black velvet box. The diamond inside was massive, flawless, and completely breathtaking in the dim light. But it was not a heavy collar. It was not a shiny, golden chain meant to hold me down. "I want to spend the rest of my violent, highly complicated life standing completely in your bright, beautiful light," he whispered roughly. "I want to build a massive, unstoppable, fiercely protective empire right beside you. Will you be my absolute equal partner, Olivia? Will you be my wife?" I looked directly at the dark, dangerous, beautiful man who had handed me back my own stolen life. I did not cry. I smiled a fierce, completely unbreakable, brilliant smile. "Yes," I answered firmly and without a single doubt. "Absolutely yes." We did not have a massive, chaotic, highly publicized Mafia wedding. We got quietly and privately married on a beautiful, secluded, sunlit beach in southern Italy. It was just the 2 of us, Anthony, and my very best friend Vanessa standing by the clear water. I stood completely barefoot in the incredibly warm, soft white sand. I wore a simple, flowing, incredibly elegant white dress that moved with the ocean breeze. I looked deeply into Dominic's dark, intense, incredibly safe eyes as we slowly traded our permanent vows. I thought deeply about the terrified, shrinking waitress who truly thought her entire life was completely over. I thought about Tyler's cold, suffocating, violent, toxic grip on my reality. I thought about the brutal, bloody, freezing alleyway in Chicago where I almost lost everything. Every single terrifying, horrific nightmare had ultimately led me directly to this bright, beautiful, unbreakable dream. Life is an incredibly strange, violent, highly unpredictable journey. Sometimes you have to walk straight through the absolute darkest, most terrifying shadows just to finally find your own brilliant, blinding, light. Trauma aggressively and ruthlessly teaches you to make yourself incredibly small. It teaches you to hide your own voice and completely suppress your own massive power. But true, profound, healthy love violently shatters that tiny, dark box into a million pieces. It forcefully drags you out into the wide open, limitless space. It gives you the heavy, sharp tools to violently protect yourself and the people you love. I am Olivia Lombardi now. I run a massive, incredibly successful, fiercely independent corporate empire. I actively and aggressively help broken women find their own fierce, unbreakable strength every single day. I am married to the absolute most dangerous, ruthless, incredibly loving man in the entire city of Chicago. We sleep peacefully every night in a massive penthouse made entirely of fragile, clear glass because we both know with absolute, terrifying certainty that absolutely no one will ever dare to throw a stone at us. Toxic love violently shrinks you. It aggressively isolates you. It maliciously makes you constantly question your own profound sanity. Healthy love makes you a towering, massive, completely unstoppable giant. Do not ever settle for a dark, suffocating, tiny cage. Wait patiently and fiercely for the person who hands you the entire, beautiful, limitless sky. 5 years pass incredibly fast when you are no longer strictly surviving minute by minute. Time completely changes everything it touches. The pro bono foundation I started is no longer just a tiny, experimental side project. It is a massive, incredibly powerful force in the entire city of Chicago. We officially bought a massive, towering brick building, right in the very heart of the South Side. It is a dedicated, fully funded, impenetrable safe haven. It has highly reinforced, bulletproof glass on the ground floor, but inside it looks exactly like a beautiful, sunlit, thriving greenhouse. We do not just give domestic abuse survivors a temporary place to sleep. We actively teach them how to write complex computer code. We teach them advanced graphic design. We aggressively teach them profound financial literacy. Education is the absolute ultimate weapon against domestic violence. You cannot just hand a victim a temporary bandage. You have to hand them the heavy armor and the sharp sword. Dominic is completely, unconditionally supportive of the entire operation. He never once interferes with my daily business decisions. He quietly placed his absolute best, most highly trained men on the perimeter, but he never once crosses the threshold into the actual building. He knows his dark, violent presence might accidentally trigger the fragile women trying to heal inside. That is what absolute, profound emotional intelligence truly looks like. He actively recognizes his own terrifying shadow. He actively chooses to keep it completely out of their fragile, healing light. We are actively changing the violent landscape of the city. We are pulling terrified women right out of the dark. We are aggressively teaching them how to build their own impenetrable financial fortresses. When you hand a victim complete financial independence, you instantly destroy their abuser's pathetic control forever. However, deeply ingrained, toxic traditions die incredibly hard. The older, brutal generation of the Chicago underworld did not like my massive independence. One of Dominic Sass' highest-ranking lieutenants was a bitter, cruel man named Vincent. Vincent absolutely hated my newfound public freedom. He firmly believed women belonged exclusively in silent, gilded cages. He actively whispered in the dark corners that I was making the terrifying boss incredibly soft, weak. Insecure people always equate mindless cruelty with actual strength. They foolishly equate basic human kindness with pathetic vulnerability. Vincent decided to aggressively test my firm boundaries. He completely bypassed my downstairs building security. He brought 2 massive, heavily armed enforcers directly up to my executive floor. He walked aggressively into my private glass office without knocking. He sat down heavily in my expensive client chair. He casually lit a foul-smelling, incredibly cheap cigar. He told me my little charity project was becoming a massive, annoying liability. He told me I was going to quietly start filtering his illegal street cash through my foundation. He wanted to aggressively force me back into a dark, tiny box. He heavily relied on my deep, paralyzing fear of making a loud public scene. But I did not even reach for my cell phone. I leaned slowly and deliberately forward over my heavy glass desk. I told him he was incredibly stupid to smoke a cheap cigar in a highly advanced smart building. I told him every single modern smoke detector in my ceiling was actually a high-definition, hidden security camera. I told him his entire clumsy, pathetic extortion attempt was currently being live-streamed directly to Anthony's highly secure server. I watched the arrogant, disgusting smirk melt entirely off his deeply wrinkled face. His skin turned a sickly, terrible shade of gray. I told him he had exactly 10 seconds to get out of my expensive chair before I completely ruined his entire pathetic life. Vincent scrambled clumsily out of my glass office like a terrified rat. He completely underestimated the absolute wrong woman. Dominic officially stripped Vincent of all his massive territories that exact same night. He showed the entire dark underworld that our equal partnership was totally, fundamentally unbreakable. Exactly 2 months after that massive corporate victory, I sat entirely alone on the edge of our massive bed. I was staring down at a small, white plastic stick in my shaking hand. There were 2 distinct, bright pink lines. I was pregnant. A sudden, massive wave of pure, unadulterated terror violently crashed right over me. It was not a fear of Dominic. It was the deep, insidious, lingering fear of a traumatized survivor. I terrified myself with dark, invasive questions. Could I actually be a good mother? Would I accidentally pass down my deep psychological scars to an innocent child? Would our child be safe in this violent, highly complicated mafia world? Dominic walked quietly into the bright bedroom. He saw the tears silently streaming down my pale face. He saw the small plastic stick shaking violently in my hand. He did not yell in triumph. He dropped instantly and heavily to both knees right in front of me. He rested his large, scarred hands incredibly gently on my trembling knees. He looked up at me with eyes so incredibly soft it actually broke my heart. We are going to completely break the generational curse. Olivia, he whispered fiercely. His deep voice was thick with absolute, undeniable conviction. My father violently crushed my mother into dust. Your ex violently tried to erase you, but this child will never, ever know what a tiny, suffocating cage looks like. We are going to raise a massive giant. We are going to teach her exactly how to command the entire room. We are going to teach her deep, profound respect for every single human life. He pressed his face gently against my stomach. I ran my trembling fingers slowly through his dark hair. The suffocating terror completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a fierce, blazing, maternal fire. True, profound healing is a very strange, quiet, deeply psychological phenomenon. You spend years desperately waiting for the painful memories to completely stop hurting. You constantly wonder if you will ever truly forget the terrifying monster in your dark past. And then one completely random Tuesday, you suddenly realize you have not thought about him in months. I was casually reading the morning newspaper at the Marble Kitchen Island. I saw a very small pathetic article buried deep on page 12. Tyler Morrison was formally arrested by federal agents in Ohio. It was a massive, highly illegal corporate fraud and aggressive embezzlement scheme. He was officially facing 20 hard years in a brutal federal prison. He tried to aggressively control his new company, the exact same toxic way he tried to control me. He tried to forcefully manipulate the hard numbers. He finally hit a massive, immovable brick wall. 5 brutal years ago. Just seeing his printed name would have sent me into a blind, hyperventilating panic. But sitting there in the warm, peaceful morning sun, I felt absolutely nothing. No residual anger, no lingering fear. Not even a dark, twisted sense of vindictive joy. I just felt a profound, heavy, complete indifference. That total, complete emotional apathy is the ultimate, final stage of surviving abuse. It is the absolute highest form of human victory. You do not win by aggressively destroying the person who broke you. You win by completely outgrowing the tiny, pathetic world they tried to force you into. You win by building a life so massive, so incredibly rich, and so profoundly beautiful that their toxic memory simply starves to death. I slowly turned the thin newspaper page. I took a slow sip of my hot decaf coffee. He was just a tiny, completely irrelevant footnote in my massive, beautiful life. Our beautiful daughter was born exactly in the middle of a massive, freezing Chicago blizzard. We named her Aurora. It literally means the beautiful dawn. She was the bright, blazing new beginning of our entire complex family line. I sat in the massive, warm nursery of our glass penthouse. I was holding her incredibly small, fragile body tightly against my chest. The brutal, freezing city winds were howling violently against the thick, bulletproof windows, but inside, it was completely warm. It was entirely safe. Dominic walked quietly into the dim room. His dark, lethal eyes were completely melted. He reached out with one massive, calloused finger. Aurora immediately wrapped her tiny, fragile hand tightly around it. He let out a shaky, profound breath. She already has an incredibly strong grip, he whispered proudly. I leaned my tired head gently against his strong arm. She is going to hold the entire world in her hands, I replied softly. And nobody will ever tell her she is too small. We stood there together in the quiet dark. We were two deeply scarred, highly complicated survivors who had completely rewritten our own violent destinies. We did not let the terrible trauma turn us into bitter, controlling monsters. We used the deep pain as heavy, solid bricks to actively build an impenetrable fortress of profound love. Do not ever let anyone tell you that you are fundamentally broken. Do not ever let a toxic, insecure partner convince you that the open sky is too dangerous. The world is incredibly vast. It is waiting desperately for you to completely unfold your wings. Find the rare, beautiful people who fiercely protect your absolute right to fly. Take up massive space, speak with a deafening, undeniable voice, and never, absolutely ever, look back.